Welcome to the show, folks! Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's as gritty as it is fascinating: gangbangs. And not just any gangbangs, man. We're talking about the real deal, the ones that make headlines, the ones that leave a mark on society. We're comparing Chicago, a city practically synonymous with gang violence, to other gang hotspots around the globe. We're talking about the history, the culture, the sheer brutality of it all. We'll break down the differences and the surprising similarities between how gangs operate in Chi-Town versus the mean streets of LA, New York, London, you name it. This isn't about glorifying violence, man, it's about understanding it. It's about looking at the factors that drive young people to this life, the desperation, the lack of opportunity, the sheer will to survive. So buckle up, because we're about to take a wild ride through the underbelly of gang culture, exploring the motivations, the consequences, and the human toll it takes. This is some real shit, folks, and we're gonna unpack it all. To truly understand Chicago's gang culture, man, you gotta go back, way back. We're talking about the early 20th century, the days of Prohibition, when Al Capone and his goons ran the streets. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, it was a different time, a time when organized crime was just finding its footing. See, those early gangs, they weren't just thugs, they were businessmen, entrepreneurs of the underworld. They provided a service, albeit an illegal one, and they held power, real power. They controlled territory, they influenced politics, they were a force to be reckoned with. But as the decades passed, things changed. The old guard faded away, and new generations rose to take their place. The focus shifted from organized crime to something more chaotic, more desperate. The gangs fractured, splintered into smaller factions, each vying for control of a shrinking pie. The rise of crack cocaine in the 80s, that was a game changer, man. Suddenly you had this cheap, highly addictive drug flooding the streets, and these gangs, they saw dollar signs. Turf wars exploded, violence escalated, and innocent people got caught in the crossfire. It became less about brotherhood, less about loyalty, and more about survival. You joined a gang for protection, for a sense of belonging, for a way to make money when all other avenues seemed closed off. And the cycle continued. Kids growing up in poverty, surrounded by violence, seeing the gang as their only way out. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, man, and it's damn hard to break. But it's not just about the drugs, man. It's about poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic racism. These kids, they're born into a system that's stacked against them from the start. They see the gangs as a way to take control, to exert some kind of power in a world that seems determined to keep them down. It's a complex issue, man, with no easy answers. Look, when we talk about the impact of gangs in Chicago, it goes way beyond the headlines, man. It's deeper than just the body count, the drive-bys, the fear that grips certain neighborhoods. We're talking about a cultural impact that seeps into the very fabric of the city. Think about it. When you grow up surrounded by gang activity, it becomes normalized. You see it every day. The graffiti, the turf wars, the constant threat of violence. It becomes part of your reality, a lens through which you view the world. Music is a powerful force, man, and in Chicago, it's been used to both reflect and influence gang culture. We've seen the rise of drill music, a raw, often violent subgenre of hip-hop that emerged from the streets of Chicago. Some argue that drill music glorifies violence, that it desensitizes listeners to the realities of gang life. Others say it's a form of expression, a way for these young artists to process the trauma and hardship they've experienced. But it's not just music, man, it's movies, it's TV shows, it's the way Chicago is portrayed in the media. It all contributes to this image of a city overrun by gangs, a city where violence is inevitable. And that image, it has real-world consequences. It affects tourism, it affects investment, it affects the way people perceive Chicago, both from the outside and from within. It creates this climate of fear, man, where people are afraid to go to certain neighborhoods, afraid to speak out against the violence, afraid to even acknowledge the problem. But here's the thing, it's not hopeless. There are people working tirelessly to break the cycle of violence, to provide opportunities for young people, to offer an alternative to gang life. There are community leaders, activists, educators, and everyday citizens who are fighting back, who are refusing to let gangs define their city. Alright, so we've established that Chicago's got a pretty intense gang situation, right? But how do they stack up against other notorious cities around the world? Let's jump into the ring and compare, man. First up, we've got Los Angeles, the city of angels with a devilish underbelly. LA gangs, they've got history, man. We're talking about the Bloods and the Crips. iconic in their own right, known for their colors, their rivalries, their grip on the drug trade. But here's the difference. LA gangs, they're more structured, more hierarchical. They've got older members calling the shots, enforcing discipline, maintaining a level of control. Now let's hop across the country to New York City, the concrete jungle where dreams are made of, and sometimes crushed under the weight of gang violence. New York gangs, they're more about turf, man. Controlling corners, protecting their blocks, it's all about local dominance. They're less concerned with building massive drug empires and more focused on holding down their own little piece of the city. You've got your Latin Kings, your Bloods and Crips sets, even some Asian gangs making moves. And then there's London, man, across the pond. They might not have the same scale of gun violence, but their gangs are no joke. They're involved in knife crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, you name it. London gangs are often based on ethnicity, with Jamaican Yardis, Turkish Mafia, and Albanian gangs all vying for power. They're more low-key, less flashy than their American counterparts, but don't let that fool you. They're just as ruthless. What's fascinating is how the global drug trade connects these seemingly disparate gangs. The cocaine that fuels the violence in Chicago might originate in Colombia, pass through Mexican cartels, and end up on the streets of London. It's a complex web, man, with tentacles reaching every corner of the globe. One thing's for sure, gang violence is a global epidemic, and while the specifics might differ, the root causes, poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic inequality, they're all too familiar. We've talked about the history, the culture, the global comparisons, but now let's get real about the underlying factors that contribute to gang violence, especially in Chicago. And let me tell you, it's a complex web of socioeconomic issues that we need to untangle. First and foremost, poverty plays a huge role. We're talking about neighborhoods where jobs are scarce, schools are underfunded, and opportunities seem few and far between. When you're struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head, the allure of quick money and a sense of belonging that a gang offers can be hard to resist. Then there's the lack of social support. Many of these kids growing up in gang-ridden neighborhoods, they're coming from broken homes, dealing with trauma, facing systemic racism and discrimination. They're looking for someone to look up to, someone to guide them, and unfortunately, sometimes the only role models they have are gang members. Let's not forget about the access to guns, man. Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, but guns still find their way onto the streets, fueling the cycle of violence. It's like a never-ending supply chain, and until we address the root causes of gun violence, it's gonna be damn hard to stop it. Now compare that to other parts of the world. In places like Japan, for example, they have extremely low rates of gun violence. Why? Well, for starters, they have incredibly strict gun control laws, but it goes deeper than that. They also have a culture that emphasizes community, respect for authority, and conflict resolution. And then there's Scandinavia, man. They've got some of the lowest crime rates in the world, and they attribute it to their strong social safety nets. They provide universal healthcare, free education, and a high standard of living, which creates a society where people feel supported and have less incentive to turn to crime. So what can we learn from this? It's not just about being tough on crime. It's about addressing the underlying social and economic disparities that create an environment where gangs can thrive. We need to invest in these communities, provide opportunities, and break the cycle of poverty and violence. Every gang has its own set of rules, its own code of conduct, right? But Chicago, man, Chicago's got this unique flavor, these specific rituals and practices that set them apart from the rest of the gang world. It's like their own twisted version of street law. Take, for example, the way they communicate. Chicago gangs, they've developed their own slang, their own hand signals, even their own graffiti tags. It's a way to identify each other, to mark their territory, to send messages to rival gangs. And then there's the initiation rituals. Some gangs in Chicago, they require new recruits to commit a crime, often a violent one, to prove their loyalty. It's a brutal practice, man, designed to desensitize these young kids to violence and bind them to the gang. Another thing that sets Chicago apart is the role of social media. Gangs in Chicago, they're tech-savvy, man. They use social media to recruit members, to intimidate rivals, to even plan and coordinate attacks. It's like a whole new battleground, a digital war zone. And It's a cowardly tactic, man, and it speaks to the utter brutality of gang culture. But here's the thing, man, these practices, they're not written in stone. They're not immutable laws. They're learned behaviors passed down from generation to generation, and that means they can be unlearned. That was a heavy one, folks. We went deep into the belly of the beast, exploring the brutal realities of gang life in Chicago, and how it stacks up against other global gang hotspots. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. We're talking about poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic racism, all these factors colliding to create a breeding ground for violence. But it's not about glorifying this stuff, man. It's about understanding it, about shedding light on a dark corner of society that often gets swept under the rug. It's about asking tough questions, challenging our own perceptions, and hopefully sparking a conversation that leads to real change. So, if this got you thinking, if it sparked a fire in your belly, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell so you don't miss out on more eye-opening content like this. And let me know in the comments what you think. What are your thoughts on gang violence? What solutions do you see? Let's keep this conversation going, because this is an issue that affects us all.